to silence, and peaceful demonstrations are being suppressed. A significant case is that of the Special Regional Administration in Hong Kong, where extended powers for national security are used against civil society and human rights defenders, which have greatly reduced the vitality of an open and free public space. The authorities have used excessive force against demonstrators in Indonesia, in Kenya, in Togo and elsewhere. The freedom of the media is backsliding, and human rights defenders are criminalized from Egypt to the Russian Federation. The report on the rule of law of 2025 of the European Commission notes that civic space is being reduced in several member states of the European Union. Some are restricting peaceful demonstrations, and others are imposing restrictions which restrict the work of NGOs. Recently adopted laws in Ecuador could reduce responsibility of law enforcement bodies, extend the powers of the secret services, and restrict the civic space. Attacks against the Constitutional Court are unacceptable. The amnesty law adopted last month in Peru is backsliding for justice and truth. Brutal responses will only provoke more tension and violence.
Human rights law protects all, including the most vulnerable. Yet, attacks on minorities of all kinds are growing as states roll back commitments to tackle and prevent discrimination. Excessive use of force and deaths of people of African descent at the hands of law enforcement persist in many states, often rooted in systemic racism. Indigenous peoples continue to be denied their rights to land and to free, prior and informed consent in mining and other commercial projects. Violations against Roma are widespread in several European countries and beyond, including police violence, hate speech, and systemic exclusion in health, education and housing. Representation of Roma in the European Parliament has shrunk to zero. In China, the progress we have sought for the protection of the rights of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, as well as Tibetans in their regions, has yet to materialize. This is a priority for my office's engagement. Restrictions of the rights of LGBTQ+ people are growing in West Africa, where some countries have adopted or are considering laws that criminalize consensual same-sex relations. In the United Kingdom, people with disabilities will be disproportionately affected by planned cuts to health benefits. In Argentina, austerity measures are having the greatest impact on people with disabilities and older people. Several countries around the world are cutting crucial programs that protect women's rights, including support for survivors of violence and access to sexual and reproductive health care. Maternal mortality is a leading killer of the most marginalized women and girls. This is a tragedy because it is largely preventable. Afghanistan, where women's access to health care, among many other human rights, is severely restricted, has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. 4 years after the return of the Taliban, the erasure of women and girls from public life is almost complete. Policies and practices that violate the rights of migrants and refugees are becoming normalized in some countries. Pakistan and Iran have forcibly returned millions of Afghans to their country, and India has also deported groups of Rohingya Muslims by land and sea. I'm also concerned about recent measures taken by Germany, Greece, Hungary and other European countries to limit the right to seek asylum. The United States has reportedly reached agreement with several governments, including El Salvador, South Sudan, Eswatini and Rwanda, on deporting third-country nationals to places other than their homeland, raising concerns about compliance with international law. Kuwait has revoked the citizenship of thousands of people in recent years, leaving many stateless. In Cambodia, changes to the constitution and nationality law allow the authorities to remove citizenship in cases of treason, creating further ways for them to target their critics. In a positive development, North Macedonia has resolved all known cases of statelessness since the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, the first country in the region to do so. Excellencies, our human rights mechanisms, including this Council, are a force field that protects people against unrestrained power. They warn us of potential harm to come, and we need to heed those warnings. Hate speech is a sign of rising tensions that can lead to violence. Around the world, we witness growing anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, racism, and large-scale disinformation campaigns. In Chad, Nigeria, and other countries in the region, conflicts between herders and farmers are aggravated by hateful narratives, escalating to deadly clashes. From South Sudan to Syria, hate speech compounds tensions and widens divisions. The lies and nihilism that fragment societies online translate into real attacks on real people. In Cambodia and Thailand, for example, social media vitriol has been a factor in today's tensions. In Spain, online media were weaponized to instigate physical violence against migrants. In Serbia, online hate speech often goes unpunished. Civic space is rapidly shrinking, with dissent stigmatized, protesters and independent journalists targeted, and the use of excessive force by the police. I reiterate my call for restraint, dialogue and accountability. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, deliberately divisive narratives and historical revisionism continue to undermine peace and reconciliation. In the context of decades of dehumanization of the other, I welcome the recent initialing of a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is an important step towards upholding and advancing human rights, reconciliation, healing and lasting peace. We are ready to support both countries in this process. Freedom of expression is fundamental, but it does not protect those who use speech to spur violence and hatred. A growing number of leaders are now instrumentalizing freedom of expression to cover their own speech while silencing those who disagree. This must be called out each and every time. My office engages with national authorities, leaders and media to develop strategies to define and counter incitement to hatred. Elections are a litmus test for government's commitment to freedom of expression and assembly and the rule of law. Here too, our human rights monitoring raises the alarm and helps to prevent violations. My office has been following preparations for upcoming elections in Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Malawi, Tanzania and Uganda. I'm deeply troubled that in many of these countries, the authorities are resorting to harassment, exclusion or detention of opposition leaders, restrictions on media freedom, bans on peaceful protest and crackdowns on human rights defenders. Such actions, coupled with disinformation campaigns and hate speech, could feed tensions, polarization and violence. I urge the authorities in these countries to reverse course immediately. Ahead of next year's election in Ethiopia, I am concerned about arbitrary detention of journalists and recent laws that may restrict freedom of association and expression. Against a backdrop of conflict in several regions, the Ethiopian authorities need to ensure conditions for fair, free and inclusive elections. I welcome the agreement for my office to establish a new presence in Bangladesh to support the transition process there. Excellencies, peace and security depend on full respect for human rights everywhere. When the Security Council, the General Assembly, this Council or other intergovernmental institutions discuss the human rights situation in a particular country, it is because this concerns us all in every country. The United Nations Charter gave birth to a new geopolitical era by enshrining the sovereign equality of states. National sovereignty is the foundation of multilateral institutions and international law. When states sign international agreements, they are exercising their national sovereignty, not limiting it. And with that sovereignty comes responsibility. Sovereignty does not mean ownership of people. All governments have a duty to treat all their people, including their political opponents, fairly, to protect them from harm and to respect their fundamental human rights. When they abandon that responsibility, it affects us all. Multilateral conventions and agreements have won incredible support over the past 8 decades and continue to do so today. As sovereign states sign up to them, they guarantee greater freedom and protection for their people. Bhutan, Cameroon, Eritrea and Lebanon recently ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Dominica ratified the Convention Against Torture, and Bangladesh ratified its optional protocol. Malaysia and Vietnam have abolished the use of the death penalty for certain crimes, and I'm pleased to report that some member states are increasing their engagement with special rapporteurs and treaty bodies. Cuba, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Dominica, Guatemala, Iceland, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Singapore, Suriname and Zambia recently accepted visits by special procedures mandate holders after more than 5 years. Libya recently accepted the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court for alleged crimes committed between 2011 and 2027. These are not empty gestures. They are tangible acts of leadership and responsibility. They confirm that the international system benefits states and their people in concrete and specific ways. When sovereign states fail to uphold perpetrators of the gravest crimes to account, it is important that others are able to step in through the principle of universal jurisdiction exercised in accordance with international law. For example, in Germany, a Syrian colonel of the former regime was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity that took place in Syria, and a court in the Netherlands convicted a corporate executive for complicity in war crimes in Guinea and Liberia. And a federal court in the United States convicted a Gambian national on charges of torture. Within sovereign states, stakeholders beyond the government can also step up for human rights. I'm very encouraged by the growing number of cities and regions that are integrating human rights into urban governance. Cities have long been cradles of diversity and freedom, values that test authoritarian rule. Our recent guidelines set out exactly what cities and regions can do to protect their people and their rights. National human rights institutions are another important defense against discrimination, abuse and the erosion of the rule of law. For example, the NHRI in South Africa is taking legal action to address hate speech. The NHRI in the Philippines has highlighted the impact of fossil fuels on the human rights of marginalized groups. Support for the independence and effectiveness of these national institutions is crucial. Civil society and social movements often drive transformational change, from anti-racism and feminism to climate activism. They are natural partners of my office, and we intend to work more closely together in the future. Philanthropists are key partners to help achieve positive change on the ground. I encourage them to collaborate and amplify their influence. The human rights and humanitarian communities find common ground in protecting civilians from the impact of conflict and crisis, and we must do more to strengthen this essential partnership. Señor Presidente, la educación en materia de derechos humanos es una de las herramientas e inversiones más importantes que tenemos para promover la libertad, evitar la discriminación y fomentar la cohesión. Me congratulo por el compromiso.
Human rights education is one of the most important tools and investments that we have to promote the future of our young people. I am delighted at the commitment and progress of some member states, from Guyana through to Mongolia, the Middle East and South Africa. We're supporting efforts to develop human rights study plans to raise up the voices of young people and to promote civic participation. But we must do much more. Each and every boy and girl, whether in the future they work in agriculture, the digital sphere, medicine or in trade, must know that human rights are our right from birth and that they affect and concern us one and all. I call on all member states to take measures and next year to share at the 63rd session of the Council their strategy
to ensure that the population are learning about human rights throughout their whole lives?
Mr. President, as my update shows, there are coordinated efforts to undermine human rights and the rule of law around the world. When states cut ties with the system or try to weaken it, when they isolate themselves, everybody loses. In response, we need a cross-regional movement to defend the international system. That is the only viable path to reach collective solutions to the existential threats we face today. Therefore, I hope to work with you on a new initiative through an alliance of member states, philanthropists, civil society and others to strengthen the human rights ecosystem and join the dots between abuses and violations and crisis prevention. This will contribute to achieving the goal of the Secretary-General's UN 80 initiative to improve coordination and to deliver better for the people we serve. We are working to convene this alliance on several fronts. First, we will enhance our engagement with all governments, even in the face of fierce disagreement, encouraging frank exchanges and keeping dialogue open. What gives me hope is that the vast majority of people around the world are crying out for human rights and freedoms. Second, we will reinforce the value of human rights to every citizen and every government through positive narratives and creative outreach. Third, we will harness innovation for human rights, including AI, by strengthening our partnerships with tech companies, academics, civil society and more. Fourth, we will develop and grow support for the human rights economy together with our partners. And fifth, with your support, we will bolster sustainable funding for human rights work by identifying new avenues and models. Because history has shown time and again that no one is safe when human rights are under attack. Abuses committed against one group are always part of a broader pattern of oppression and lead to the wider erosion of fundamental freedoms. Human rights are meant to challenge our assumptions, to identify the blind spots and encourage self-critical reflection because no one is perfect. Our human rights mechanisms are one of the only parts of the multilateral system that has teeth. I encourage you to use them. Engaging with my office and the human rights system as a whole is valuable not for engagement's sake, but to achieve tangible progress for people everywhere. Together, we must refuse to back down in the face of discrimination, distortion and lies. Together, we need to safeguard 80 years of progress on freedom, equality and justice. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much indeed, High Commissioner. We will now take a brief break before undertaking the enhanced interactive dialogue on the human rights situation in Myanmar. Thank you.
Excellences, distingués collègues, nous allons maintenant entamer le dialogue interactif renforcé sur la situation des droits humains des musulmans Rohingyas et d'autres minorités au Myanmar. Merci. J'ai l'honneur d'accueillir M. Volker Turk, haut commissaire aux droits de l'homme, qui prononcera la déclaration d'ouverture. Permettez-moi également de souhaiter la bienvenue à nos distingués intervenants. M. Nicolas Kumjan, chef du mécanisme d'enquête indépendant pour le Myanmar, merci d'être là. Nous aurons Moon Nai Lee, défenseur des droits humains au Myanmar par vidéo. Lucky Karim, directrice exécutive de Femmes réfugiées pour la paix et la justice. Et Saouk, défenseur des droits humains au Myanmar. Merci à vous aussi d'être présents. La liste des orateurs sera close dans 15 minutes. Est-ce que, chers collègues, je vous prie de prendre vos places et de continuer vos petites discussions utiles et nécessaires hors de cette magnifique salle, s'il vous plaît. Un peu de calme. Merci. Je passe la parole à l'haut-commissaire. Monsieur Volker Turk, vous avez la parole.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished participants, the human rights situation in Myanmar is plumbing new depths, with civilians throughout the country suffering the cruelest toll. Since the coup, more than 7,000 civilians have been killed by the military, and some 30,000 people have been arrested on political grounds. In August alone, a reported 277 civilians were killed across the country. After resuming ground operations, the military is once again burning villages at alarming rates and abducting and forcibly recruiting civilians. In one of many documented incidents that reveal an utter disregard for civilian lives, in March, the military attacked a market in Let Banha village in Mandalay. According to witnesses, a jet fighter circled the area, diving and climbing several times before dropping two 500-pound bombs on the crowded market, killing at least 27 civilians. While their activities are far smaller in scale and intensity, anti-military armed groups have also killed people perceived to be affiliated with the military, used landmines and forcibly recruited civilians. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. Military blockades have driven food prices up to record levels. The cost of an average diet rose by 30% compared to last year, while household incomes have plummeted. Nearly a third of the country's population, some 15.2 million people, are facing acute food insecurity this year. That represents an increase of almost 2 million people in a year. Some 350,000 people have been displaced in Rakhine and Chin states since November 2023, and some 150,000 Rohingya have crossed into Bangladesh seeking safety. Reported figures of 3.3 million displaced since the coup are likely an underestimation. Excellencies, the decades-long persecution of the Muslim Rohingya minority in Rakhine State has escalated. Over the past 14 months, fighting in Rakhine has reached a fever pitch as the Arakan army and other armed groups have joined the campaign of cruelty against civilians. 8 years after the Myanmar military killed tens of thousands of Rohingya, inflicted widespread sexual violence and triggered an exodus of 700,000 people to Bangladesh, the Arakan army has taken control of nearly all of Rakhine State. It has killed, abducted, tortured, arbitrarily detained and forcibly recruited Rohingya and burned homes and villages. In one awful example, on 5 and 6 August 2024, drones and artillery strikes killed hundreds of Rohingya civilians who had gathered along the Naf riverbank or were already on boats trying to flee to Bangladesh. Survivors attributed these strikes to the Arakan army. As the Myanmar military has lost ground, it has increasingly used aerial attacks against civilians across Rakhine and committed grave violations of human rights, including killing civilians, destroying property, arbitrarily arresting and torturing people, and forcibly recruiting them into ranks. Rohingya armed groups are also committing abuses against civilians, including killings, forced recruitment and displacement. Some of the videos and images in northern Rakhine from the second half of 2024 are reminiscent of 2017. While there are no comprehensive verified figures during the reporting period, thousands of civilians are alleged to have been killed, with tens of thousands more fleeing violence. Violations and abuses by both the Arakan army and the military have gone unpunished. Rohingya reportedly left their homes ahead of clashes or because of targeted violence by the Arakan army, whose fighters had threatened or attacked those who refused to leave. Rohingya have also reported growing restrictions and surveillance of their communities, including internet shutdowns and seizure of mobile phones. These have hampered our ability to document fully all violations. Other minority communities, including ethnic Rakhine, are also suffering under airstrikes and artillery barrages, resulting in untold numbers of killings and mass displacement. Military blockades have severely restricted humanitarian access. Hunger and malnutrition are at an all-time high, with 57% of families unable to meet basic food needs. Amid growing violations and violence, the military is now seeking legitimacy by organizing military-controlled elections. The people of Myanmar demand justice, peace, and democratic, civilian-run institutions, as my report in June highlighted. Conditions do not exist for free and representative elections. I echo ASEAN's view that de-escalation and humanitarian access are the way out of this crisis, not elections. The military must implement Security Council Resolution 2669, which demands an immediate end to all forms of violence, urges the release of arbitrarily detained prisoners, and calls for constructive dialogue, reconciliation and respect for human rights. All parties need to allow humanitarian relief to civilians in need and to lift all restrictions. Parties in Rakhine must respect in full the provisional measures imposed by the International Court of Justice to protect Rohingya lives. Excellencies, for more than 4 years now, my office has reported horrible violations to this Council. We have issued recommendations for action to stop the wanton violence and rampant impunity, as have other human rights mechanisms. You, the international community, have all the information you need to act. I repeat my call for the Security Council to refer the full situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. I'm encouraged by the actions taken by the International Criminal Court, including the prosecutor's application for an arrest warrant against the Commander-in-Chief of the Myanmar military, Min Aung Hlaing, for alleged crimes against humanity, as well as the prosecutor's indication that more such applications would follow. I also welcome the imposition by several countries and one regional organization of targeted sanctions against individuals and companies in Myanmar. But much more is clearly needed. States need urgently to stop the flow of arms into Myanmar, including jet fuel and dual-use goods, and to resume peace-building efforts. Finally, I once again urge all governments to do everything possible to protect people fleeing the conflict in Myanmar, including by search and rescue operations at sea, and to refrain from refoulements, including pushbacks. I encourage them to create safe and dignified pathways for international refugee protection and resettlement, particularly for the Rohingya. The high-level conference on the Rohingya at the General Assembly later this month is an opportunity for the international community to back its words of support with concrete action. We must hear and heed the voices from Myanmar calling for peace and for democratic civilian-run institutions. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je donne la parole à Monsieur Nicolas Koumjian pour sa présentation. Vous avez la parole.
Merci, Mr. President, Excellencies. It is an honor to present to this Council the 7th annual report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. At the risk of repeating what I have said each year since the 2021 military coup, serious international crimes are being committed in Myanmar ever more frequently, and the suffering of Myanmar's people continues to worsen. The mechanism has gathered evidence of the military arresting thousands of perceived political opponents without fundamental due process, and systematically torturing detainees by inflicting beatings, gang rape, and other forms of sexual violence. The military is increasingly relying on aerial attacks to target opposition forces and civilian populations which oppose military rule. We have intensified our investigations into airstrikes that hit hospitals, homes, places of worship, IDP camps, and schools where there's no apparent military target in the vicinity. We are gathering evidence of the chain of command of the Myanmar Air Force to help establish who gave the orders for these attacks. In Rakhine State, we are investigating recent reports of aerial bombings of civilians by planes and drones, torture and rape, killings, the use of civilians as human shields, and obstruction of humanitarian aid to a population threatened with starvation. Rohingya remaining inside Rakhine are often victims. About 150,000 Rohingya have been newly displaced to Bangladesh, but all ethnic communities in Rakhine State are suffering. We are investigating allegations of very serious crimes allegedly committed by both the Myanmar military and the Arakan army. We have evidence of instances where both the Myanmar military and various opposition forces around the country have summarily executed captured combatants or civilians accused of being informers. This includes, in some instances, solid evidence of the identity of the perpetrators. Allow me to make it clear so that everyone, but particularly commanders of all factions in Myanmar, hear my message. The laws of war protect civilians and captured fighters. Civilians must not be targeted, and captured fighters must not be tortured or executed. Whenever we receive reports of such crimes, regardless of the politics or ethnicity of the perpetrators or the victims, we will gather the evidence so that one day the perpetrators and commanders who failed in their duty to prevent and punish such crimes will be held to account. Mr. President, the mechanism has collected and analyzed evidence from more than 1,300 sources, including more than 600 eyewitnesses. We are grateful for the information that individuals and civil society organizations provide to us, often at great risk. We use this evidence to facilitate criminal prosecutions in national or international courts. We have shared vast amounts of evidence and analysis for proceedings at the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and with the Federal Prosecutor's Office in Argentina concerning crimes against the Rohingya. We are also responding to specific requests for information from authorities in the United Kingdom and other jurisdictions, often concerning post-coup violence. ASEAN, in its 5-point consensus, and this Council have called for an end to the violence in Myanmar, but each year the violence grows worse. If crimes remain ignored and unpunished, perpetrators will be emboldened to commit further atrocities. To break this cycle of impunity, we must have sustained political will. The mechanism stands ready to support relevant national and international jurisdictions that are willing and able to prosecute these crimes and bring an end to the suffering of the Myanmar people. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je donne maintenant la parole à Moon Naili pour un message par vidéo.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Human Rights Council, High Commissioners, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to deliver this statement on behalf of the Women League of Burma, an umbrella organization of 12 women rights groups representing diverse ethnic communities across Myanmar. We deeply value the Council vital role in defending human rights worldwide and welcome these opportunities to share our perspective in these critical dialogues. Since the military coup in 2021, civilians across Myanmar have been subjected to relentless violence, airstrikes, arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial killing, and systematic sexual violence. The country has been plunged into political, economic, and humanitarian turmoil, with more than 3 million people displaced. Women and girls, in particular, continue to bear the brunt of this violence. Cases of sexual violence have sharply increased, with the junta as the main perpetrators. WMB and its members organizations have consistently documented this atrocity, crimes that constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide. To date, we have gathered more than 1,058 cases supported by testimonies, photographs, videos, documents, and maps. One of the most brutal incidents was the rapes and murders of 2 Kachin teachers in Gongkar village, northern Chan State. In January 2015, they were sexually assaulted and killed by Myanmar military soldiers who then tampered with evidence to obstruct justice. This case reflects the wider systematic use of sexual violence by the military as a weapon of war and repression. Under the international law, such crimes may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, falling under the jurisdictions of the International Criminal Court. Their systematic targeting of ethnic community also equals the atrocity crimes currently under examinations at the International Court of Justice. Mr. President, decades of impunity have emboldened the military. Without justice, there can be no peace or democracy in Myanmar. Survivors deserve truth, reparations, and accountabilities. We ask the international community to act with urgency. Silence and inactions only emboldens the hunters. The United Nations, member states, and international courts must uphold their obligations to ensure these crimes are recognized as violations of international law and that perpetrators are brought to justice. We therefore call on the Human Rights Council to 1. Condemn the Burmese military juntas for killing civilians and executing human rights defenders in the strongest terms, and take effective action to stop further executions and atrocities. Second, institute a comprehensive global arms embargo with robust monitoring and enforcement mechanisms to end the direct and indirect supply, sale, or transfer of all weapons and other equipment that may be used for trainings, intelligence, and military assistance. Third, enact targeted sanctions against the Burmese militaries and process to effectively cut off their financial flow. Finally, reverse the situation on human rights in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court for their crimes against humanity, which have been perpetrated against innocent civilians, including peaceful protests and ethnic groups. Justice delay is justice denied. For the people of Myanmar, justice cannot wait. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Madame Loki Karim pour sa présentation, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last month, the 25th of August, 2025, marks the 8th anniversary of the Rohingya genocide that forced more than 1 million people, including myself and my family, to flee home. Genocide is a process. It did not end when we fled home, and it continues to happen to my community. The recent conflict between the Arakan Army and the military, especially since the 4th of August 2024, forced tens of thousands of Rohingya people to flee home and rejoin their existing families in Cox's Bazar. Therefore, nearly 1.3 million people are languishing in the world's largest refugee camp today, more than half of whom are women and children. They all depend on the humanitarian aid and the food rations that come from the World Food Program, WFP, once a month. In the past few years, the humanitarian crisis in Myanmar has gotten worse. People are starving. People have no security at all. Meanwhile, in the camps in Bangladesh, people have very limited access to education and livelihood opportunities. Over the past year and a half, we have seen increased numbers of refugees, especially women and children, risking themselves on tiny boats on the seas for weeks to flee to neighboring countries, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, expecting a better life. Most of them die in the sea, and others are arrested on the Myanmar border and are put in jail on a passport case for 5 years or longer. Only a small number manage to arrive at their destination, where they are not recognized or welcomed as refugees. 2017 is not the first time Rohingya became refugees in our neighboring country, Bangladesh. Rohingya were forced to flee many times from the 90s and even earlier. Thousands of refugees in Kutupalong, who are called the registered refugees, have lived there for generations. Over decades, each time we were sent back to Myanmar, and as we began to settle in and rebuild our lives, we were over and over again forced to flee our homes, back to Bangladesh. This time we want a permanent solution, so the Rohingya refugees don't have to keep going back and forth. Ultimately, the solution for our community should be found within Myanmar and within Rakhine State. As an intermediate steps towards this goal, the internally displaced people, IDPs, must be able to return to their homes safely, without any restrictions or conditions. The humanitarian crisis in Myanmar must be addressed. Aid must be delivered in Rakhine State, Myanmar, for the remaining members of the Rohingya community and other minorities to improve their condition and situation. The refugees in Cox's Bazar must get education following the Burmese curriculum, must have security and protections, and must receive sufficient aid funding to survive while they are in the camps. An accountability mechanism for atrocities committed against the Rohingya community must be instated in Myanmar. Our ultimate goal is to return back to our country one day, to find a sustainable solution, a dignified, voluntarily, and safe repatriation to our homes. Rakhine State has never and will never exist without Rohingya and other minorities. As we think through the long-term solutions, it is crucial for the government to ensure the meaningful and safe participation of Rohingya community members in any political dialogue and talks with the Myanmar authorities. I call on the international community to pay the much-needed attention to our Rohingya community, and I call on donor countries to commit resources to meet the Rohingya community's urgent needs. It is a collective responsibility for us to protect the Rohingya community from further genocide and injustice. I hope the member states and all relevant stakeholders will implement this recommendation and take immediate actions. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à M. Tsaouk pour sa présentation, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Special Rapporteur Tom Andrews has often described this body as the conscience of the world. That description is increasingly true and increasingly urgent. In a world scarred by insanity, barbarism, and the erosion of compassion and empathy, those of us living through some of the darkest situations look to this Council as the last source of hope and moral compass. Now more than ever, this Council must not merely be a forum of speeches, but must act decisively to inspire that last hope. I stand before you not as a politician or a general, but as a human rights defender, a believer in truth, justice, and freedom. Like thousands of others, I've spent my entire adult life defending the dignity of Myanmar's most marginalized people. I'll not repeat the counting of our dead or the tally of our destroyed lives. Enough has been said. Instead, I ask this Council and each member state represented here to confront a single question. In the immediate aftermath of the 2021 coup, the Secretary General declared, and I quote, "We will do everything we can to mobilize all the key actors in the international community to put enough pressure on Myanmar to make sure that this coup fails." 4 years later, this Council, the so-called the conscience of the world, must look itself in the mirror and ask, have we truly done everything? Have member states done enough to make the coup fail? Because the junta is doing everything to make it succeed through relentless airstrikes, massacres, and terror aimed at silencing the population so it can stage a sham election built on fear. I cannot forget the faces behind these crimes. My colleague, Tuy Diem, a journalist and human rights defender, was among them. On January 6, 2022, he and 9 others, including a 13-year-old boy, were taken by soldiers in Matupi Township. 2 days later, their bodies were found murdered, their bodies bound, gagged, and brutally stabbed. That single act of cruelty captures the daily reality for thousands across Myanmar. Ordinary people silenced with unimaginable violence, their lives erased without justice. In this climate of terror, the weakest ethnic and religious minorities have become easy prey. Villages are burned, churches and mosques destroyed, entire communities erased simply for who they are. If this council is truly the conscience of humanity, then its member states cannot turn away while the most vulnerable are sacrificed first. Mr. President, it is no longer enough for member states to issue statements while doing little to stop the impunity with which the military murders, burns, and terrorizes. It is no longer enough to stand by in silence while bombs fall on children or to whisper concern while minorities are hunted down. Impunity, whether by the junta or non-state actors, must end. Therefore, today, we call on this Council and all member states of the United Nations to urge the Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court to ensure those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity are held to account. Adopt and enforce a comprehensive global arms embargo, including an immediate ban on the aviation fuel so that no more bombs fall on villages, hospitals, schools, and places of worship. Impose stronger coordinated sanctions targeting the military sources of revenue and power so that it can no longer finance its campaign of terror. Excellencies, this is the test of whether the conscience of the world has meaning or whether it's just words. History will judge us all, but the people of Myanmar cannot wait for history. They need action and they need it now. The world promised this coup would fail. It is time for member states to make good on that promise. Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci de vos présentations et témoignages. La liste des orateurs est maintenant close. J'invite à présent les délégués intéressés à poser des questions aux présentateurs et à formuler des commentaires sur leurs déclarations. Je rappelle que le temps de parole est limité à 1 minute et 30 secondes pour chaque intervention. Et je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Canada au nom d'un groupe de pays.
Thank you, Mr. President. Canada is pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of Australia, New Zealand, and my own country, Canada. We thank the High Commissioner and the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for their update. Reports of escalating war crimes and crimes against humanity committed across Myanmar are gravely concerning. The human rights situation has severely deteriorated due to the regime's continuing use of airstrikes, causing civilian deaths and widespread destruction. Women, children, and the elderly, among the most vulnerable, are caught in the crossfire. A viable future in Myanmar must include justice and accountability. We commend the leadership of the United Nations in supporting the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and Special Rapporteur in collecting evidence of serious crimes against the people of Myanmar, including to support ongoing justice processes related to crimes committed against the Rohingya. Until there is an end to violence and an inclusive political process, there can be no lasting peace. We strongly urge the military regime to engage in genuine and inclusive political dialogue with all stakeholders. Elections held without these essential steps risk greater instability. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante du Royaume des Pays-Bas au nom d'un groupe de pays.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm honored to deliver this statement on behalf of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We thank the High Commissioner and the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for their reports and align ourselves with the European Union statement. We remain deeply concerned with the ongoing human rights crisis in Myanmar, which has continued to deteriorate since the military coup in 2021. The earthquake in March was yet another tragedy for the people of Myanmar. We are deeply alarmed that fighting, including airstrikes, continues. We urge the military to cease aerial bombings. We call for immediate, safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all communities in need. We reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Myanmar and commend them for their resilience in their demand for a peaceful, democratic future. We also continue to support the efforts of the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar and call for full accountability for the crimes committed. Mr. Kumjan, what can the international community do to further support accountability mechanisms to end impunity and achieve justice for the people of Myanmar? I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Union européenne.
The European Union thanks the panelists and welcomes the High Commissioners and the IIM reports and updates. The assessment in the High Commissioner's report that some of the violations and abuses suffered in northern Rakhine by the Rohingya is reminiscent of the 2017 atrocities is a cause for particular alarm. Widespread and systematic patterns of indiscriminate attacks by the military on civilians persist, enabled by arms transfers. So do grave human rights violations and abuses committed by the Myanmar military and other actors. The continued work of the IIM in collecting evidence and identifying perpetrators of these crimes is indispensable for ensuring accountability. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners, including State Councillor San Suu Kyi. The EU reiterates call for unhindered humanitarian access, stability, peaceful reconciliation, and for the swift establishment of a transparent, inclusive, and credible democratic process. We reaffirm our support for the UN and ASEAN's efforts in this regard, and the full implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2669. We would like to ask the panelists, what is your assessment of the Myanmar's military and its allies' plans to organize elections in December 2025 and January 2026?
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de l'Estonie au nom d'un groupe de pays.
Monsieur le Président, I have the honour to speak on behalf of the Nordic Baltic states. We reiterate our strong support for the critical work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. Its latest report provides further evidence of serious crimes, including war crimes and crimes against humanity committed across Myanmar. We are alarmed by the rise of deliberate attacks on civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, such as schools, places of worship and medical facilities. Such acts are utterly unacceptable. We commend the mechanism's approach in documenting crimes against children and placing this issue at the forefront of its agenda. Perpetrators of such crimes must be brought to justice before impartial courts. We welcome the notable progress made by the Independent Investigating Mechanism for Myanmar in ongoing judicial proceedings during the reported period, which represents above all an important step in advancing accountability for crimes committed against the Rohingya population. These efforts send a clear message that justice will be pursued and those responsible for violations of international law will be held accountable. We are concerned about the liquidity crisis facing the mechanism, which threatens its vital mandate. We must work together to overcome these challenges. Mr. Kumian, what more can be done to stop Myanmar's military's attacks on civilians? I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Pakistan au nom de l'Organisation de coopération islamique.
Mr. President, the OIC thanks the High Commissioner and the head of mechanism for their reports. OIC is deeply concerned over the reports of mass killings, atrocities, arson and forced conscription against the Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine. The ongoing conflict that continues unabated has forced more than 150,000 Rohingya Muslims to flee to Bangladesh and thousands to other countries, especially since November 2023. The mechanism has a crucial role to advance accountability and justice for the Rohingya. The OIC calls upon the mechanism to continue and possibly enhance its close and timely cooperation with the courts, tribunals, including the ICJ. We commend Bangladesh and other countries in the region for their continued support to the mechanism, including facilitating its regular visits. The OIC deeply regrets Myanmar's persistent non-cooperation with the mechanism, including its indifference to the requests for country visits. Part of finding a durable solution to the Rohingya crisis, Myanmar should fully cooperate with the mechanism. we underscore that it is critically important for the OHCHR, as well as mechanism, to continue uncovering evidence of atrocities and crimes committed against the Rohingya Muslims. Lastly, the OIC calls on all member states to provide adequate support towards the implementation of mandated activities of OHCHR and the mechanism for the Rohingya. I thank you.
Merci. La parole à la distinguée représentante de l'Indonésie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indonesia remains deeply concerned by the continued worsening crisis in Myanmar. The reports of the High Commissioner and the mechanism underscore the need to end all hostilities and atrocities and guarantee unhindered access for humanitarian aid in all areas in Myanmar. Indonesia has consistently worked with ASEAN to promote durable resolutions, including by advancing the implementations of the ASEAN 5-point consensus and strengthening delivery of humanitarian assistance through the AHAS Center. Indonesia has also pursued its bilateral initiatives, including engaging with all relevant stakeholders in Myanmar and providing humanitarian support to affected communities. Mr. President, we call upon the international community to remain steadfast in its attention to Myanmar. This crisis must not be allowed to slip from the global agenda. Sustained international support and cooperation are important to uphold justice, address the plight of Rohingyas and other affected communities, and contribute to lasting peace in Myanmar. Finally, Indonesia reaffirms its unwavering support to the aspirations of Myanmar people to achieve peace, stability, democracy, and full enjoyment of human rights. I thank you.
Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Thaïlande.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand appreciates the High Commissioner and the IMM for their reports. We continue to attach importance to finding viable solutions for Myanmar through implementation of the 5-point consensus, as well as engagements with Myanmar and various stakeholders. Thailand has also conveyed to all sides in Myanmar our willingness to facilitate constructive dialogues. Amidst the ongoing conflict, frequent natural disaster and global humanitarian funding cuts, the situation continues to worsen. Ensuring timely and unimpeded humanitarian assistance remains crucial. Thailand will continue to provide assistance in public health and education to ensure that vulnerable populations along the Thailand-Myanmar border are secured. As needs are immense, we welcome support from the international community. Thailand also recognizes the humanitarian challenges faced by the Rohingyas. Last year, we contributed through UNICEF and the World Food Programme to provide training for teachers and food rotation in Cox's Bazar. We will do more in line with our pledge at the Global Refugee Forum. We also look forward to participating in the high-level conference on the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other ethnic minorities in Myanmar in New York. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bangladesh welcomes both the reports of OSCHR and IIM. We appreciate IIMM for its continued work to collect and preserve evidence of crimes committed in Myanmar, including against the Rohingya. We also take good note of the mechanism's close engagement with the ICJ, ICC, and other national courts to ensure accountability and justice for the Rohingya. Mr. President, Bangladesh regularly facilitates IIMM's missions to Bangladesh and will continue to cooperate with the mechanism pertinent to its work on the persecuted Rohingya. Bangladesh underscores that mechanism's access to Myanmar is critical for fully gathering and collecting evidence of crimes committed against the Rohingya. We urge Myanmar to fully cooperate with IIMM. Mr. President, Bangladesh is deeply concerned at the ongoing conflicts in Rakhine, which continues unabated. Over 150,000 Rohingya have fled to Bangladesh since November 2023, putting additional burden and mounting pressure over already overcrowded camps in Cox's Bazar. It is further exacerbated due to the diminishing trend of humanitarian assistance for the Rohingya. Bangladesh reiterates that sustainable repatriation is the only durable solution of this protected Rohingya crisis. Bangladesh expects that the upcoming high-level conference of Rohingya this September will provide a clear pathway for the expedited solution of the crisis in a sustainable manner. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Malaisie.
Mr. President, Malaysia is gravely concerned over the escalation of the conflict and the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Myanmar. We urge all parties to immediately halt indiscriminate violence, ensure the protection and safety of all civilians and civilian infrastructures, as well as create a conducive environment for an inclusive national dialogue and for the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance. We commend the mechanism for its tireless efforts in collecting, preserving and analyzing forensically valuable evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed across Myanmar by multiple parties, particularly against the Rohingya. We welcome the adoption of the mechanism strategic plan for 2025-2027, particularly in the context of strengthening its operational resilience and investigative and analytical capacities. As chair of ASEAN, Malaysia is committed to facilitating a path towards a peaceful resolution in Myanmar. We urge continued support from the international community for the full and effective implementation of ASEAN's 5-point consensus. We hope that a credible and durable solution will enable the safe, voluntary and dignified return of Rohingya refugees. We urge member states who are signatories to the Refugees Convention to expedite the resettlement of refugees and asylum seekers, including the Rohingyas, to third countries on the principle of burden and responsibility sharing. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Gambie.
The Gambia thanks the High Commissioner and the IIMM for its vital report, which documents systematic and indiscriminate use of airstrikes by the Myanmar military, killings, torture, sexual violence, and crimes against or affecting children, including their conscription in hostilities. We deplore crimes targeted at Rakhine, Rohingya, those detained by the military since the coup, and other civilian communities across Myanmar. We remain deeply concerned about the fresh displacement of large numbers of Rohingya into Bangladesh. We agree with the report's observation that in the face of impunity for the most serious crimes, calls for the violence to end will remain an illusion. Therefore, the Gambia reiterates its unwavering commitment to enforce Myanmar's erga omnes obligations under the Genocide Convention and to deliver justice for the Rohingya and all victims in Myanmar. We look forward to the UN High-Level Conference on the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar on 30th September and encourage all states to fully support and adequately resource the mechanisms in order to enhance collection of vital evidence on the most serious international crimes committed in Myanmar. The Gambia calls for the cessation of indiscriminate attacks and guarantees of unhindered humanitarian access for all civilians. We echo support for a survivor victim center, gender-sensitive and trauma-informed approach to the mechanism's work to ensure that any future return of the Rohingya is voluntary.
Mr. President, the Lao PDR thanks the High Commissioner and Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for the reports. The Lao PDR reaffirms its commitment to play an active role, especially through ASEAN, in helping Myanmar to achieve Myanmar-owned, Myanmar-led durable and find the restoration of peace, stability, and reconciliation in the country. We welcome the positive development in Myanmar for its preparation for the upcoming general elections. We also commend Myanmar for the constructive cooperation and engagement with ASEAN, member states, as well as the relevant UN agency in providing humanitarian assistance, including medical supply and relief items for the victims of the earthquake and all people in need without discrimination. We call upon the international community to pursue constructive dialogue and cooperation to support Myanmar in order to achieve lasting peace and national reconciliation and sustainable development. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Albanie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Albania thanks High Commissioner for his presentation, his office, and the independent investigative mechanism for their comprehensive and deeply concerning report on the situation in Myanmar. The finding presented, along with recent development, underscore the urgent need for accountability and justice over war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Myanmar. The humanitarian situation in Myanmar has deteriorated dramatically, with millions of people currently displaced due to ongoing armed conflicts and natural disaster. The situation in Rakhine states remains dire. The Rohingya population continue to suffer from mass killing, forced displacement, denial of humanitarian aid. We remain deeply concerned by continuous and escalating violations perpetrated by the military authority, including indiscriminate airstrike, torture, sexual violence, and targeting civilians, including children. The targeting of children and utilization of sexual violence as a weapon of war are particularly concerned. These acts are unacceptable and must cease immediately. Mr. President, Albania stands in solidarity with people of Myanmar and reaffirms its commitment to justice, human rights, and rule of law. Accountability must prevail and impunity must end. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de Koweït.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يضم وفد بلادي صوته إلى بيانات المجموعات التي ينتمي إليها ويعبر عن بالغ القلق حيال ما ورد في التقرير قيد النظر بشأن كافة الانتهاكات ضد مسلمي روهينجا وخاصة في ولاية راخين والمتمثلة في عمليات القمع والتطهير العرقي التهجير القسري والتدمير الممنهج للبنى التحتية المدنية بما في ذلك دور العباد مما أدى إلى ازدياد عدد لاجئي مسلمي الروهينجا والذي بلغ أكثر من 1.3 مليون حسب ما ورد في تقارير المفوضية السامية لشؤون اللاجئين. سيد الرئيس، تؤكد دولة الكويت على أهمية معالجة الأسباب الجذرية للأزمة في ميانمار وضرورة الوقف الفوري لجميع أعمال العنف وذلك امتثالا لقرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2669 كما تحث بلادي المجتمع الدولي على تعزيز الجهود الرامية لتأمين العودة الآمنة والكريمة والمستدامة والطوعية للاجئي ونازحي الروهينجا. وفي الختام ووفقا لما ورد في التقرير سالف الذكر حول استمرار الانتهاكات لحقوق الإنسان في ميانمار وخاصة ولاية راخين ومع ازدياد عدد النزوح، ما هي الآليات المبتكرة التي يمكن للمجتمع الدولي تبنيها لدعم عمل اللجنة لتحقيق العدالة ومساعدة ضحايا أعمال العنف بفعالية أكبر؟ وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Merci. Je donne la parole à UNICEF.
Thank you, Mr. President. UNICEF welcomes the report of the High Commissioner and of the IIMM, which are sobering. UNICEF recognizes the increasingly challenging environment in which the mechanism operates. More than 4 years into the escalation of the conflict, the situation for children in Myanmar is desperate. Grave violations against their rights, including killing and maiming and denial of humanitarian access, as well as poverty, continue to devastate children's lives. The escalation of conflict in many parts of the country, compounded by natural disasters, has left civilians, especially children, acutely vulnerable. Attacks by all parties keep driving fear, displacement, and suffering, leaving families with little protection. The presence of landmines, unexploded ordnance, and remnants of war throughout the country multiplies those risks. Essential services for children, in particular education and healthcare, including vaccinations, have been severely disrupted for years, depriving millions of learning and critical care. This will have intergenerational impacts. We call on all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international law, protect civilians, and allow life-saving humanitarian assistance to reach those in urgent need. We also urge all parties to immediately cease all actions that endanger civilians and abide by international human rights and humanitarian law. We also call on parties to protect all children from grave violations. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de Chypre.
Mr. President, Cyprus aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner and the IIM for their reports. We strongly condemn the continued escalation of violence and grave human rights violations committed by the Myanmar military since the 2021 coup, which continue to take an intolerable toll on civilians. We are appalled by evidences of indiscriminate airstrikes, civilian deaths from artillery attacks, and torture and abuse of detainees, including sexual violence. Equally alarming are the allegations highlighted in the report on the use of chemicals. We remain deeply concerned by the scale of violence against children, including reports of forced recruitment and reprisals against families that refuse to comply. It is unacceptable that the military continues to obstruct humanitarian access, even in the aftermath of natural disasters. Cyprus reiterates its support for strengthening accountability mechanisms in Myanmar, including the IIM. We call on the military to cease all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law and to ensure full, safe and timely humanitarian access in line with humanitarian principles. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Italie.
Italy aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU and thanks OHCHR and the head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for this update. We remain deeply concerned by the pattern of atrocity crimes since the 2021 coup, indiscriminate attacks against civilians, systematic torture, sexual and gender-based violence, and the ongoing persecution of the Rohingya and other minorities. The mechanism's findings remind us that accountability cannot be postponed. Justice is essential for any credible path toward peace and reconciliation in Myanmar. Italy strongly supports the IIMM's mandate and commends its cooperation with accountability processes. We urge all states to fully cooperate with the mechanism and preserve its evidence in the fight against impunity. We also call for an immediate end to violence, the release of political prisoners, and the resumption of a truly inclusive democratic transition. A voluntary, dignified, and safe return of refugees can only occur within a democratic Myanmar. Humanitarian access must be ensured throughout the country, especially for communities most affected by conflict and disasters. Italy will continue to stand with the people of Myanmar to support civil society and to work with partners for justice, accountability, and human rights. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Arabie Saoudite.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. اطلعت بعثة بلادي باهتمام على تقرير المفوض السامي بشأن حالة حقوق الإنسان في ميانمار، وتتابع المملكة عن كثب التطورات الجارية هناك. وفي هذا السياق تدعو المملكة جميع الأطراف المعنية على المستوى الوطني إلى الحفاظ على قنوات الحوار البناء بما يفضي إلى حلول عملية ومستدامة. السيد الرئيس، تؤكد المملكة مجددا موقفها الثابت والداعم لحماية المدنيين في ميانمار ولا سيما مسلمي الروهينجا، وتدعو إلى ضمان سلامتهم وأمنهم والاعتراف بحقوقهم الأساسية دون تأخير، بما في ذلك الحق في المواطنة الكاملة. كما تشدد المملكة على ضرورة تهيئة الظروف الملائمة لعودة آمنة وكريمة للاجئي الروهينجا إلى موطنهم الأصلي. ومنذ اندلاع الأزمة حرصت المملكة على القيام بدورها الإنساني والإنمائي تجاه الروهينجا، إذ استضافت أعدادا منهم كمقيمين على أراضيها، وقدمت لهم الرعاية الصحية الشاملة وفرص العمل، انطلاقا من التزامها الراسخ بمبادئ التضامن الإنساني. كما أسهمت المملكة في دعم الروهينجا في عدد من الدول من خلال برامج إنسانية وإغاثية شملت مجالات التعليم والمأوى والصحة. ختاما السيد الرئيس، تجدد المملكة التزامها بمواصلة دعم قضية الروهينجا والعمل مع المجتمع الدولي لضمان حصولهم على حقوقهم المشروعة وتمكينهم من العيش بسلام وكرامة في وطنهم. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. We take note of a report on the situation in Myanmar. Vietnam remains deeply concerned about the continued violence, instability, and humanitarian challenges in Myanmar, which have severely affected the lives of ordinary people. We stress the importance of prioritizing the well-being of the people of Myanmar, ensuring safe and unhindered humanitarian access, and fostering conditions conducive to peace, national reconciliation, stability, and sustainable development. We reaffirm ASEAN's consistent and principled position on the 5-point consensus as the main framework for supporting Myanmar in addressing its challenges. Vietnam supports the ongoing efforts of the ASEAN Chair, the ASEAN Special Envoy, and the AHA Center in delivering humanitarian assistance, promoting dialogue, and building trust. We also welcome the outcomes of the 46th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur in May 2025, which reaffirmed ASEAN unity, centrality, and commitment to a practical, constructive, and non-politicized approach in assisting Myanmar. We look forward to continued cooperation with the United Nations and relevant partners in support of ASEAN's central role and constructive contribution to peace, stability and development in the region. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Inde.
Mr. President, India takes note of the High Commissioner's report on Myanmar's human rights situation. We reiterate our consistent position and call for immediate cessation of violence, release of political detainees, and unhindered humanitarian access. We remain deeply concerned over the deteriorating humanitarian and security situation that continues to impact India's northeastern states through increased influx of people and escalating transnational crimes, including drugs, arms, and human trafficking along our shared border. India supports all efforts aimed at fostering trust and advancing a Myanmar-owned, Myanmar-led transition towards a peaceful, stable, and democratic future. As Myanmar's immediate neighbor and development partner, India has consistently prioritized people-centric initiatives. Following the March 2025 earthquake, we launched Operation Brahma, delivering over 1,000 metric tons of relief materials and deploying medical teams as the first responder. This exemplifies our commitment, building on Operation Sadbhav during Typhoon Yagi and our assistance during previous natural disasters. Beyond emergency response, India continues supporting Myanmar's infrastructure development and stands ready to assist the developmental needs of all communities. As our Prime Minister stated recently, there is no military solution to this conflict. Enduring peace can only be achieved through inclusive dialogue and the early restoration of democratic processes via credible, inclusive elections. We continue to coordinate closely with ASEAN under the 5-point consensus while supporting the UNSG's efforts towards a peaceful resolution. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, Mr. President, High Commissioner and distinguished panellists. Your latest reports reveal the deeply troubling evidence of human rights atrocities committed in Myanmar, including by the Myanmar military. Civilians are bearing the brunt, detained without due process, killed in indiscriminate airstrikes and displaced as their homes, schools and hospitals are destroyed. The Myanmar military's intensified use of airstrikes following the March earthquake inflicted further devastation on civilians, compounding the crisis. The mechanism has uncovered extensive evidence of systematic torture and abuse in detention facilities operated by the military since the coup. Detainees, including children, have been subjected to beatings, electric shocks and sexual violence, including rape and sexualised torture. These reports expose a pattern of deliberate cruelty, underscoring the urgent need for justice. The international community must do more to ensure perpetrators are held to account. The UK remains committed to supporting future accountability in Myanmar. The IIM's documentation plays a vital role in laying the groundwork for this, and the UK has contributed £900,000 to the mechanism to help ensure that evidence is preserved and justice can be pursued. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Bulgarie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bulgaria aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner and the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for the reports and updates. Bulgaria remains deeply worried by the overall humanitarian situation in Myanmar. We express concern with the widespread and systematic human rights violations and abuses perpetrated against persons belonging to the Rohingya and other ethnic and religious groups by the security and armed forces of Myanmar. Bulgaria welcomes the support of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for ongoing proceedings related to the crimes committed against the Rohingya in 3 jurisdictions and ongoing proceedings in the UK covering crimes against both the Rohingya and other groups in Myanmar and crimes committed since February 2021 military coup. Bulgaria urges, we call for the immediate end of the military campaign and the release of all political prisoners. Bulgaria urges for a constructive, inclusive and peaceful dialogue between the stakeholders aimed at restoring democracy and the rule of law in country. We reiterate our call for full, safe and unhindered access to provide humanitarian assistance to all those in need. Bulgaria commends ASEAN's efforts to improve the situation in Myanmar, support the ASEAN 5-point consensus and highly appreciates the work of the ASEAN Special Envoy for Myanmar. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Tchéquie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Czechia aligns itself with the EU statement. Czechia remains deeply alarmed by the worsening human rights situation in Myanmar. Both reports under discussion document systemic violations, including airstrikes, torture, sexual violence, and forced displacement, particularly affecting the Rohingya and other minorities. We are appalled by the military's continued use of air attacks, even in earthquake-stricken areas, and the deliberate targeting of civilians, schools, and hospitals. The persecution of the Rohingya through killings, forced recruitment, and denial of humanitarian aid has intensified under both the Myanmar military and the Arakan army. We commend the mechanism's work in supporting international accountability and urge all states to cooperate fully. Czechia calls for an immediate end to all violations, unrestricted humanitarian access, and protection for displaced communities. We reaffirm our commitment to human rights, accountability, and the dignity of all people in Myanmar. Mr. President, what concrete steps can be taken to ensure that the Rohingya and other victims of atrocity crimes are not only protected, but also meaningfully included in the future justice and peace processes? Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Suisse.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie les intervenants pour leurs exposés et les rapports du Haut-Commissaire et du mécanisme. Nous restons profondément préoccupés par les rapports sur une escalade des crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité commis par toutes les parties au conflit. Comme noté par le Haut-Commissaire, les civils, y compris les minorités ethniques et religieuses, continuent d'être les principales victimes avec plus de 7000 morts vérifiés. Nous notons avec une inquiétude particulière les crimes commis dans les lieux de détention. Le rapport du mécanisme documente des preuves accablantes de torture systématique ainsi que de violences sexuelles. Ces pratiques doivent cesser immédiatement. Nous saluons les avancées importantes des enquêtes relatives aux opérations nettoyage de 2016 et 2017. Nous suivons avec une vive préoccupation la dégradation de la situation de l'État de Rakhine qui souligne l'urgence de mettre fin à l'impunité et de garantir les droits de l'homme et les libertés fondamentales des membres de toutes les communautés. Monsieur et Madame les intervenants, comment la communauté internationale peut-elle contribuer à créer un environnement propice à l'arrêt de la violence, à la justice et à la réconciliation du Myanmar? Je vous remercie.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Chine.
主席先生、高专先生，缅甸问题本质是缅甸内政，中方一贯主张坚持缅人主导、缅人所有，支持缅走符合本国国情的发展道路，维护国家利益，广泛团结国内的政治力量，恢复稳定和发展，促进和保障人权。人权理事会有关讨论应当有助于缅和平和解、经济社会发展，而不是激化矛盾分歧，加剧局势动荡。中方主张各方建设性的对话与合作，反对公开施压做法。近期，中方根据缅相关方意愿诉求，积极开展劝和促谈的工作，并取得了积极的成效。中方将继续为此而努力，也呼吁国际社会从缅人民的利益出发，为缓和缅局势、助力缅发展、保障缅人权切实发挥建设性的作用。中方支持缅甸与孟加拉国对话协商，逐步解决若开邦避乱民众遣返问题，也将继续提供力所能及的帮助。国际社会应当支持两国在已有基础上加強溝通，為推進緬遣返進程積累更多有利條件。謝謝主席及高瞻先生。
Thank you, Mr. President. The security and humanitarian situation in Myanmar has been worsening. The effects of the coup d'etat continue across the country and in all sectors. Turkey reiterated its support for the democratic transition of Myanmar. Noting the announcement to hold the elections by late 2025 or early 2026, we will closely following the electoral process and its outcome. Elections must be free, fair, and reflect the will of the Myanmar people. Turkey supports ASEAN's 5-point consensus. We remain concerned by the deteriorating security conditions since October 2023, especially in the Rakhine state. Rohingya Muslims have been the most affected. We reiterate our call on all parties to respect international law, protect civilians, and allow unhindered flow of humanitarian aid. For a sustainable solution, it is vital to ensure accountability for the human rights violations against the Rohingyas and other minorities in Myanmar. ICJ ruling on the admissibility of the Gambia's application is a crucial step in this regard. We commend Bangladesh's generosity and reaffirm our joint responsibility to ensure the voluntary, safe and dignified return of the Rohingya people to their homeland. Turkey continues to stand by the Rohingyas and support them in various fields, including health, housing, education and income-generating projects. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Slovénie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner and the Independent Investigative Mechanism for their comprehensive reports. We remain concerned over reports of ongoing violence, including torture, sexual and gender-based violence, attacks on civilian populations and the denial of humanitarian assistance. Entire communities continue to face indiscriminate attacks, forced displacement and the destruction of essential infrastructure. The March 2025 earthquake displaced over 1 million people and caused thousands of deaths. In disaster-affected areas, the military continued attacks and obstructed humanitarian aid. Slovenia reiterates its call for an immediate cessation of all violence against all civilians, including the Rohingya community, and calls for their protection in compliance with the international humanitarian and human rights law. The efforts in collecting and preserving evidence of these serious violations is crucial to supporting international efforts aimed at justice and accountability. Ending impunity is the necessary first step towards justice, peace and reconciliation in Myanmar, and the international community must act decisively to uphold these principles. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Roumanie.
Romania aligns with the EU statement. We want to thank the High Commissioner and the investigative mechanism for their reports. Romania expresses serious concern about the ongoing human rights crisis in Myanmar, a human rights calamity, the High Commissioner said at the beginning of our session. As we just heard, we are witnessing widespread and systematic patterns of indiscriminate attacks by the military against civilians, forced displacement, forced recruitment, disappearances, arbitrary arrests, and denial of humanitarian assistance. We strongly urge the Myanmar military to immediately stop the violence, restore Myanmar's democratic political system, and implement ASEAN's 5-point consensus. In the light of the ongoing violations of international law and the prevailing impunity, we must pursue all available legal avenues for accountability. Romania will support all efforts in this regard, including universal jurisdiction and the work of the Council through its mandate holders. We urge the Council to maintain focus on accountability in Myanmar. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante du Japon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. High Commissioner and Mr. Commission, we thank you for your reports. 4.5 years after the coup in February 2021, the human rights situation in Myanmar remains dire, with people suffering intolerable violence, including ongoing airstrikes, and many still detained. Crimes in detention facilities such as torture and sexual violence continue to be reported. Japan is gravely concerned by and deplores the continuing deterioration of the human rights situation in Myanmar. Myanmar's current regime lifted the state of emergency and announced plans to hold general elections between December 2025 and January 2026. We assert that these elections should serve as a step towards restoring a democratic political system. If general elections are held without any visible progress in this regard, it could provoke strong backlash from the people of Myanmar and hinder a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Japan once again strongly urges the Myanmar military to take concrete action to immediately stop the violence, release those detained, and swiftly restore Myanmar's democratic political system. We continue to stand with the people of Myanmar and provide various types of support to improve the humanitarian situation and enhance the livelihoods of the people of Myanmar. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la France.
Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, la France souscrit à la déclaration de l'Union européenne et vous remercie pour votre rapport, qui fait état des atrocités endurées par la population en Birmanie et dont la junte porte l'essentiel de la responsabilité depuis 2021. Les forces de sécurité ont affaibli l'état de droit jusqu'à sa quasi-disparition et se sont rendues coupables de violations systématiques des droits de l'homme en multipliant les détentions arbitraires, les violences sexuelles et les actes de torture, y compris sur des enfants. La France réitère son soutien aux mandats et mécanismes permettant l'établissement des faits nécessaires à la lutte contre l'impunité, dont le mécanisme d'enquête indépendant des Nations Unies pour la Birmanie. En 2019, le bureau du procureur de la CPI a ouvert une enquête pour crimes contre l'humanité commis contre la population rohingya. La France exige la pleine mise en œuvre de la résolution 2669 du Conseil de sécurité, la cessation des violations du droit international, des attaques contre la population civile et la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle des prisonniers politiques, y compris la conseillère pour l'État Aung San Suu Kyi et le président Win Myint. Le respect du droit international humanitaire est une obligation pour la junte. La junte doit garantir un accès complet, sûr, rapide et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire. La France rappelle son soutien aux efforts de l'ASEAN en faveur de la résolution de la crise, notamment le consensus en 5 points. Seul un dialogue entre toutes les parties, y compris l'opposition démocratique, pourra garantir une sortie de crise pacifique et durable.
Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de Bélarus.
Благодарю, господин председатель. В отношении новых докладов по Мьянме вынуждены вновь обратить внимание на игнорирование голоса и позиции мьянманских властей. Основные усилия международных организаций и заинтересованных стран должны быть направлены не на изоляцию Мьянмы, а на выработку эффективных путей к скорейшему прекращению конфликта, обеспечение безопасности гражданского населения, надлежащее обеспечение всех нуждающихся гуманитарной помощью, поддержку уязвимых групп населения. Убеждены в необходимости отказа от давления на власти страны, в том числе в форме применения УПМ. Только равноправный и конструктивный диалог с правительством, поддержка национальных и международных усилий, включая региональные инициативы в рамках АСЕАН, могут способствовать разрешению кризисной ситуации и реальному улучшению ситуации в сфере прав человека на местах. Благодарю за внимание.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la Fédération de Russie.
Господин председатель, Россия уделяет пристальное внимание развитию ситуации в Мьянме. Приветствуем решение мьянманских властей отменить действовавшее в стране с 2021 года чрезвычайное положение и начать подготовку к проведению национальных парламентских выборов. Исходим из того, что поиск пути регулирования кризисной ситуации в Мьянме должен основываться на уважении принципов суверенитета, невмешательства во внутренние дела и равноправного диалога. Выступаем против попыток возложить всю ответственность за нынешнюю ситуацию на власти в Нейпидо. Осуждаем практику ряда государств по использованию многосторонних площадок, включая СПЧ, для оказания давления на правительство Мьянмы. Односторонние санкционные меры, политизация правозащитной повестки и попытки изоляции лишь усугубляют положение мьянманцев и препятствуют конструктивному взаимодействию с этой страной. Приветствуем стремление АСЕАН содействовать поиску путей нормализации ситуации внутри и вокруг Мьянмы, в том числе решению гуманитарных проблем. Полагаем, что запланированный на 19 сентября визит делегации данного объединения в страну для ознакомления с процессом подготовки к выборам будет только способствовать улучшению ситуации в Мьянме. При этом категорически не приемлем попытки Запада перехватить у АСЕАН ведущую роль в данном процессе. Призываем все заинтересованные государства продолжить дальнейшее налаживание диалога с властями в Нейпидо при отказе от политизации правозащитной повестки. Благодарю за внимание.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante de la République islamique de l'Iran.
Mr. President, and thank you, High Commissioner, for presenting the report. The Islamic Republic of Iran expresses its deep sadness over the continuous suppression and human rights violation of the Rohingya minority in Myanmar. The reports on deliberate burning of villages, closure of hospitals, and a blaze of medical stocks causing numerous preventable deaths in Rakhine State is both painful and distressing. Deceptive conscription practices, including false promises of citizenship, constitute additional factors which, alongside forced displacement, perpetuate the systematic violation of human rights in Rakhine State. Considering the critical responsibility of governments in preventing human rights abuses Iran once again urges Myanmar's authorities to ensure the protection and security of Rohingya Muslims, fully recognize their fundamental rights, including citizenship, and foster the conditions necessary for the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable repatriation of Rohingya refugees to their homeland. Mr. President, Iran supports all the international and regional efforts conducive to a lasting solution to this complex crisis, including those undertaken by OIC and ASEAN, and appreciates countries that are hosting Rohingya refugees in spite of their own challenges and difficulties. Mr. High Commissioner, how United Nations can help the officials in Myanmar to participate in Human Rights Council and make them more accountable for what is happening under their administration. Thank you very much.
Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Espagne.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. España se suma a la declaración de la Unión Europea, agradece los informes del Alto Comisionado y del Mecanismo Independiente de Investigación. Estos informes evidencian, a nuestro juicio, dos realidades. Primero, que las violaciones masivas de los derechos humanos no son asunto interno de los Estados, porque tienen repercusiones más allá de sus fronteras sobre la paz y la seguridad regionales. Segundo, que los mecanismos de investigación de los que se dota el Consejo tienen un papel fundamental en la documentación de las violaciones como primer paso en la lucha contra la impunidad. Desde el año 21 se está cometiendo en Myanmar todo el amplio catálogo de violaciones de derechos humanos que figura en los informes, matanzas, desapariciones forzadas, torturas, etcétera, etcétera. Todo ello agravado por la inseguridad alimentaria y por los efectos de los recientes desastres naturales. Los informes también documentan la situación particularmente severa en el estadio de Rakhine, la persecución contra los rohingyas y otras minorías. Pero no podemos permitir la vuelta a las atrocidades del año 17 ni que continúe el desplazamiento forzado de personas. España hace un llamamiento a las partes en conflicto para que cesen en el uso de la violencia, el fin de la persecución de los rohingyas y demás minorías étnicas y a que se permita el rápido acceso de la ayuda humanitaria. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante des Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Maldives welcomes the comprehensive reports presented today. We remain gravely concerned by the worsening situation in Myanmar. The latest findings point to an alarming escalation of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including indiscriminate airstrikes, systematic torture, sexual and gender-based violence and attacks on civilians, even in the wake of natural disasters. We are particularly disturbed by the plight of Rohingya who continue to suffer persecution, displacement and denial of their fundamental rights. Credible evidence of the destruction and appropriation of Rohingya villages further undermines prospects for their safe and dignified return. We take note of the ICC prosecutor's request for an arrest warrant against a senior military leader. These developments send a clear message that impunity will not prevail. The Maldives renews its call for an immediate end to violence, the release of political prisoners, and unhindered humanitarian access. We commend Bangladesh for hosting Rohingya refugees and its continued support to the mechanism and reaffirm our support to the Gambia's case of the ICJ as an intervening state. We remain steadfast with the people of Myanmar in their pursuit of justice, democracy and human dignity. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Colombie.
Agradecemos el desarrollo de este diálogo conjunto sobre los informes del Alto Comisionado y del Mecanismo Independiente de Investigación para Myanmar. Destacamos el trabajo del mecanismo de investigación que ha permitido documentar crímenes de guerra cometidos en todo Myanmar por distintos actores, tanto antes y después del golpe de Estado del 2021. Valoramos profundamente estos esfuerzos esenciales para evitar la impunidad, garantizar el derecho a la verdad y asegurar la justicia para las víctimas. Reconocemos los esfuerzos del Alto Comisionado en el seguimiento y monitoreo de la situación de derechos humanos en el país. Hacemos un llamado urgente a todas las partes en el conflicto a detener sus acciones armadas, respetar el derecho internacional humanitario, proteger a la población civil y permitir el acceso seguro y sin restricciones de la ayuda humanitaria para todos aquellos que la requieren con urgencia. Muchas gracias.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Égypte.
السيد الرئيس، تأخذ مصر علما بتقرير الآلية المستقلة لجمع الأدلة المتعلقة بالجرائم الدولية الجسيمة وانتهاكات القانون الدولي في ميانمار، وتؤكد إدانتها الكاملة لجميع الانتهاكات ضد أقلية الروهينجا، وتعرب عن أسفها إزاء استمرار وضعهم المأساوي، وتطالب حكومة ميانمار بوضع حد لتلك الانتهاكات من خلال اتخاذ الإجراءات الكفيلة بتوفير الحماية اللازمة لهم وإيجاد حل دائم للأزمة. هذا وتدعم مصر جميع الجهود على المستويين الإقليمي والدولي الرامية لتفعيل المحاسبة في هذا الصدد، وتدعو مكتب المفوض السامي للتواصل والتعاون مع منظمة التعاون الإسلامي أخذا في الاعتبار محورية دور المنظمة في تلك القضية. كما تسمم مصر في هذا الإطار دور بنغلاديش وجهودها المستمرة لمواجهة تداعيات أزمة الروهينجا، وتدعو المجتمع الدولي لتقديم الدعم اللازم للدول المستضيفة لهم والنظر في حلول عملية ومستدامة لمشكلة اللاجئين. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la République bolivarienne de Venezuela.
Gracias, señor presidente. Alentamos a seguir apoyando los esfuerzos de buena fe en la búsqueda de una paz duradera y del desarrollo sostenible del pueblo de Myanmar, con un enfoque no politizado, con estricto apego al derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, al respeto a la soberanía y a la no injerencia en los asuntos internos de los estados. Reconociendo la complejidad de la situación en Myanmar, destacamos los esfuerzos emprendidos para resolver las diferencias existentes mediante un diálogo político. Asimismo, rechazamos nuevamente la aplicación de medidas coercitivas unilaterales, que, como ha sido señalado por diversos relatores especiales, generan un impacto negativo sobre los derechos humanos de las poblaciones. Venezuela seguirá abogando por la vigencia de los derechos humanos de la población, alentando los esfuerzos por la paz y la reconciliación nacional en Myanmar, exhortando un diálogo político como vía esencial para solucionar las diferencias en el país. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Merci. C'était la dernière intervention sur ma liste. Nous passons à la liste des institutions nationales des droits de l'homme et des organisations non gouvernementales. Je donne la parole à Fortify pour une intervention par vidéo.
Fortify Rights welcomes the reports of the High Commissioner and the IIMM and thanks them for their tireless efforts to ensure accountability for the crimes occurring in Myanmar. Mr. President, after sustaining heavy battlefield losses as a result of coordinated resistance military operations in late 2024, the Myanmar junta is increasingly using its air force to indiscriminately attack civilians and civilian infrastructure in opposition-held and contested territory. A recent Fortify Rights report documents a series of airstrikes in Kachin and Karenni states that killed hundreds of civilians and destroyed homes, schools, and hospitals, and likely constitute war crimes under international law. Our investigation also reveals the names and ranks and positions of 22 Myanmar military and Air Force commanders and personnel individually responsible for ordering or authorizing airstrikes that have killed and maimed countless civilians. Fortify Rights calls on the international community to implement targeted and coordinated sanctions against the individuals named in our report and others responsible for international crimes in Myanmar. Responsible governments must also now take decisive action to disable the global supply chain that continues to enable the Myanmar junta's crimes, in particular, those providing aviation fuel to the junta's planes. Fortify Rights is also deeply concerned by the Arakan Army's systematic crimes against Rohingya civilians in Rakhine State. We have documented killings, torture, and arson attacks. The forces opposed to the junta's crimes must not sink to their level of death and destruction and must abide by international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Edmund Rice International.
Mr. President, we welcome the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. The fact that the report continues to find evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed more frequently and with greater intensity is particularly important in the context of the upcoming high-level conference. The conditions for the voluntary return of Rohingya refugees are clearly not present on the ground. In previous statements, we have raised concerns regarding the devastating aerial attacks perpetrated by the Myanmar military on civilians and civilians' infrastructure, including IDP camps, schools, religious buildings and health facilities. The report has highlighted the traumatising impact that the strikes have had on mental health, in particular on children who live in constant fear of attacks from above. The humanitarian situation in Myanmar and in refugee camps in Thailand and Bangladesh continues to worsen. The lack of urgent humanitarian assistance could force refugees back to dangerous conditions in Myanmar. we request Member States of the United Nations to 1. Scale up much-needed humanitarian funding in Myanmar, prioritising support to local and grassroots organisations that provide essential services and aid. 2. Urgently reverse humanitarian funding cuts supporting camps hosting refugees from Myanmar and neighbouring countries. And 3. Immediately cease the transfer of arms, jet fuel, surveillance equipment or technologies that risk contributing to violations and abuses of international humanitarian and human rights law. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Humanists International par video.
Thank you, Mr. President. I make this statement on behalf of Humanists International and Burmese Atheists. Burmese Atheists is a grassroots humanist organisation, and I make this statement on their behalf as they face grave security risks for expressing dissent. We thank the IIMM for its work and the High Commissioner for his report. The IIMM's evidence must support the process of holding those who have violated international law accountable. These crimes include indiscriminate bombing, extrajudicial killings, forced conscription, unlawful detention, and systematic acts of repression against civilians, including ethnic and religious minorities. Continued cooperation between the IIMM, this Council, and the ICC towards justice is a necessity, and we urge Member States to support these processes. We express great concern at the military regime's plans to hold elections this coming December. While we of course hope and strive for a return to a democratic Myanmar, these elections represent nothing but the junta's attempt to manufacture democratic legitimacy. Despite the purported end to the state of emergency, military occupation remains. No electoral outcome can be deemed legitimate when conducted under such conditions of coercion and exclusion. Any credible electoral process must be inclusive, transparent, and conducted free from coercion. There must be a credible opposition, and the junta must release trade unionists and political opposition leaders, including State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. Independent media must be restored, and human rights, including freedom of expression and of association, must be guaranteed. We urge this Council to unequivocally reject the sham electoral process and mobilise coordinated efforts to recognise and vindicate meaningful civilian rule in Myanmar. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Human Rights Now.
Multiple violations by Myanmar's military make it impossible to expect that its planned national election will be free or fair, including its elimination of all independent media. It is the dissolution of more than 40 opposition parties, its suspension of civil and political protections allowing for warrantless arrests and arbitrary surveillance, the ongoing conflict which excludes large areas of the country from the election, and a new electoral law imposing severe punishments for speech and protests against the electoral process. These follow the military's pattern of flagrant civil and political rights violations, including more than 22,000 political prisoners since the coup. A sham election will only legitimize the military's abusive rule. The military is also continuing to target civilian areas with indiscriminate attacks, exacerbating Myanmar's humanitarian emergency. Over 22 million people require urgent humanitarian assistance, and more than 3.5 million have been displaced. But the UN humanitarian response plan has only been 12% funded, and the military continues to blockade and obstruct aid delivery. We call on the military to restore Myanmar's democratically elected government, immediately end the conflict and end all measures violating civil and political rights, and free all persons arbitrarily arrested. We call on states to greatly increase aid to Myanmar, impose appropriate sanctions and weapons and jet fuel embargoes against the military, and require companies to conduct heightened due diligence and end any business supporting the military until its violations end. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Mr. President, 8 years have passed since the world condemned the Rohingya genocide. Yet this genocide continues. Now our people face abandonment by the international community. Food rations for more than 1 million refugees in Cox's Bazar have been cut. Children go hungry. Inside Myanmar, conditions are even worse. The military have replaced bullets with starvation. They are blockading aid and trade to deliberately deprive civilians of food. In central Rakhine, more than 120,000 Rohingya, half of whom children, remain confined to camps, surviving on scraps of root vegetables as the bare minimum cash assistance runs out. In northern Rakhine, Arkan army are subjecting our people, arbitrary arrests, torture, sexual violence, forced labor, and mass killing. Last year's massacre at Hoyasiri, described by a survivor as river of blood, is just one example. The genocide continues, now by two oppressors. We call on this Council and Member State to fully fund Rohingya humanitarian response, demand and end blockades and weaponized starvation in Myanmar, ensure accountability for crimes by both military and Arkan army, including by publicly supporting the arrest warrants by the Argentina court for senior military figures in our universal jurisdiction case, protect Rohingyas in Bangladesh and protect Rohingya in Rakhine State, guarantee Rohingya participation in decision shaping our future. Doing nothing is not neutral, it is a choice to let genocide continue.
I give the floor to Legal Action Worldwide.
High Commissioner, our team on the ground in Bangladesh continues to document ongoing violations of human rights in Myanmar by the military junta. Survivors from Rakhine State report severe abuses by the Arakan army, including restrictions on movement and livelihoods, forced labour, arbitrary arrests and acute hunger. Despite extensive evidence of ongoing atrocities, the United States has lifted sanctions on allies of Myanmar's generals. The military continues to find new ways to escape remaining sanctions ahead of sham elections planned for December. Meanwhile, in Bangladesh, school closures in the camps following aid cuts have further stripped Rohingya children of any hope for their future. The International Court of Justice hearings will advance next year, but justice for the people of Myanmar requires coordinated action now. Through increased and strengthened sanctions, use of universal jurisdiction to initiate investigations and prosecutions for core international crimes, and unwavering political pressure. Hundreds of Rohingya that we represent demand reparation, including citizenship and access to land destroyed or confiscated by the military and Arakan army. This Council's recent resolution highlighting the need for reparations is a step in the right direction. Rohingya urged Member States to address restoration of rights, including access to land, in the Rohingya Future Roadmap. We asked the panel, how can this Council ensure Member States prevent further harm, as well as survivors' rights reparations? Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Human Rights Research League par video.
Thank you, Mr. President. The persecution of the Rohingya has not ended. It has shifted. Today, it is not only the Myanmar military. Rohingya civilians are also under attack by the Arakan army through killings, forced conscriptions, sexual violence, starvation, and blocked aid. In Bangladesh, over 1 million Rohingya remain trapped in limbo. Education has collapsed, leaving children at risk of trafficking and early marriage. In MSF hospitals, we met girls as young as 12 giving birth after rape. Yet even in these conditions, Rohingya women and youth are creating spaces of resilience, but their strength cannot replace international responsibility. We urge this Council to acknowledge ongoing crimes, including by the Arakan army, expand protection pathways, resettlement visas, community sponsorships, immediately restore humanitarian funding, reject premature repatriation until rights and citizenships are guaranteed. Babies are being born stateless, children grow up without education, and survivors of sexual violence carry unbearable burdens. These are not accidents, they are the predictable result of inaction. We urge this Council to act with urgency, courage, and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Federation for Human Rights Leagues by video.
Mr. President, FIDH and members ALTSEAN Burma and Women's Peace Network condemn the sham election being set up by Myanmar's illegal junta. This unlawful process fails to meet all relevant international standards. Political parties that won more than 90% of seats in 2020, including the National League for Democracy, are excluded. There is deliberate disenfranchisement of over 3 million people, including more than 1 million Rohingya. On 29th July, the junta enacted a law that imposes jail and even the death penalty on those who speak or act against the sham elections. UN member states and development partners must not legitimize this process in any way, whether it is providing technical or material assistance or election observation. The sham elections are a recipe for disaster with serious implications on Myanmar's neighbors, including those sitting on this council, such as Bangladesh, China, and Thailand. The only possible outcomes will inevitably fuel instability and displacement in Myanmar and across its borders. We urge UN member states and development partners to explicitly reject these polls and to press the junta to end attacks against civilians, release all political prisoners, surrender power, and allow for a swift return of a democratically elected civilian government without delay. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the International Bar Association for a joint statement.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, the International Commission of Jurists, the Law Council of Australia, the Law Society of England and Wales, and Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada condemn the ongoing systematic atrocity crimes that have been carried out chronically in Myanmar. Since the 2021 military coup, arbitrary arrests and detention and unfair trials of perceived opponents of the military regime remain widespread. Over 1,800 people have reportedly died while detained by the military junta, amid reports of systematic torture and other ill treatment of individuals in detention, including rape and other sexual violence and denial of medical care. Judges reportedly dismiss lawyers' credible allegations of torture, with forced so-called confessions being routinely relied upon by courts to convict perceived opponents. Military-controlled courts have sentenced over 170 people to death without respect for due process, fair trial rights, or judicial independence. Lawyers face severe and undue restrictions on the exercise of their professional duties, having to work under a constant fear of being arrested. Credible sources report that 68 legal representatives have been arrested since the 2021 coup. We again urge this Council to respond decisively to the human rights crisis in Myanmar and call on the international community to use and support all necessary and effective means to ensure justice and accountability for all crimes under international law. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada for a joint statement.
Mr. President, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada and the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute join the High Commissioner's continued call on the Myanmar military and other armed groups to seize violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. During the 4 years since the military coup in Myanmar, there has been an unabated rise in indiscriminate and systemic attacks on ethnic minorities by the junta. 3.5 million are displaced and over 20 million are in humanitarian need across Myanmar. The root cause of violations is the unbridled impunity of Myanmar's military, including laws that violate international law, implemented by courts subsumed by the junta. Absent the rule of law and independent courts, most crimes committed by the junta are unreported. More than 22,300 are unlawfully detained without access to independent courts or adequate legal representation. Torture, ill-treatment, and extrajudicial killings are routine, along with arrests of lawyers. At least 53 lawyers have been arrested since the coup. Military-controlled courts have sentenced 172 detainees to death. We call on all council members, observer states, and UN bodies to halt engagement with the junta and stop the flow of weapons. Engage with the national unity government, ethnic communities, and civil society to strengthen local governance systems, and promote a Security Council resolution for a full referral to the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole aux panélistes pour leurs remarques finales. Vous disposez de 3 minutes chacun. Monsieur Saouk, vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to emphasize on the fact that the military junta, as we speak, is planning on holding an election on top of the countless bodies and the anguish of the millions of people of Myanmar. Please do not legitimize these elections. It will worsen the situation. It will compound the suffering of people and stretch our suffering for many, many more years. Please do not legitimize or give any credibility to these elections. ASEAN has already stated that within its 5-point consensus, there's no mention of elections. The military junta for the last 5 years has not delivered on any of the points mentioned by ASEAN, not to mention of the elections. Even the first point of ceasing the violence has not been implemented. So the military junta must be held to account, and the member states has the responsibility to assist to make sure that this coup fail, because the Secretary General himself has already stated that his mission is to make the election fail. Almost 5 years later, we are still finding in ourselves in a situation where the military is actively attempting to legitimize itself through the elections. And make no mistake, violence will increase and the suffering of people will increase if you let the military hold these elections. Anyone who has engaged in killing and committing atrocities against its own citizens, civilians, thousands of them, should not have anything to do with elections. And the members have the responsibility to make sure that the international order of decency, of humanity still exists, and it has to start with this council. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Lucky Karim, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, Mr. Nick IIM, and Mr. High Commissioner. Please allow me to thank all the countries that host majority of the Rohingya communities, including Bangladesh, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, and more. And thank you to all the donor countries for providing life-saving assistance to the millions of refugees in Bangladesh and also in Southeast Asian countries. Also, thank you to the INGOs, UN agencies, and the member states and all the stakeholders for your continuous support. The upcoming high-level conference on the 30th of September in New York is an opportunity for all of you and for all of us to support our effort in ending the genocide in Myanmar and finding a sustainable solution for the millions of refugees that are displaced in our neighboring country. As I mentioned by my fellow speakers already, the sham election the military regime is talking about in December or later this year is not going to be free or fair at all, and is being rejected already by all the ASEAN countries, as we've seen in this statement. Moving forward, as we think through the short-term and the long-term, medium-term solutions for the refugees, this is not the right time for us to talk about repatriation for the millions of refugees that are in Bangladesh to an unsafe and unchanged situation in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick, please.
Thank you. There were several questions about what member states can do about stopping these attacks, especially the attacks that are affecting children and other non-combatants. I think one important message, of course, that you can send is that these attacks will not go unpunished. These crimes won't go unpunished when civilians are specifically targeted. And to do that, states need to show their resolve, their political will. Part of that is by saying it won't be tolerated, and we will support courts and mechanisms that will collect evidence and prosecute these cases. Our own mechanism is facing severe financial limitations. The whole United Nations and many of the NGOs also in this room know about that. But we're having, despite having 20% cuts in our staff, we also have no funding starting next year for several fundamental aspects of our work. Our open source research unit that has obtained so much evidence that we can find these days on the internet and has contributed so significantly to our investigations. We have no funding starting next year so far. The same with Crimes Against Children and Sexual Violence Unit. This unit has been funded up till this year, through the end of this year. We have no funds for next year. We also don't have any funds to support witness protection measures and measures to provide psychological support to witnesses. We have many brave witnesses who come to us and talk about being detained, being tortured, often being raped in detention. We want to be able to provide some kind of psychological support to these individuals, but that depends upon additional contributions.
Also, states can help us by making it clear that they will allow us to conduct activities, our evidence-gathering activities on their territory, and interview witnesses on their territory. This is fundamental to us gathering the evidence. Further, states can help us by helping us protect key witnesses. We're not a police force, and we can't grant anyone a visa or travel document. But often witnesses with key evidence are in very dangerous situations. We want to be able to find, have the ability to bring them to a place where they'll be safe, where we can interview them, and where they'll be available for further testimony. And finally, it's important to support states that use extraterritorial jurisdiction, that exercise these various forms of universal jurisdiction. Hopefully one day these cases, these crimes will be judged in Myanmar, and we can share our evidence with Myanmar courts that are committed to real justice, protection of witnesses, and due process. But until that day comes, it's important to have these other jurisdictions to support them, those that can bring some justice to the people of Myanmar. Thank you very much.
Thank you much. Monsieur le Commissaire, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. And also thanks to all of you for the statements that you have made in response to the very rapidly deteriorating situation in Myanmar. Just before I answer some of the questions, let me point out one thing that I have also addressed in my global update. When we talk about sovereignty and internal affairs, let's also look at the Charter again. And the Charter makes it absolutely clear that when it comes to matters of international concern, such as human rights, that this is not in any way an interference in the domestic affairs of a country. In fact, sovereignty comes with responsibility. And if one looks at the data, not only the data that we have presented today, but also the data of when you look at the development of the conflict, when you look at the intensification of the conflict nationwide, if you look at the humanitarian situation with 22 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, with over 15 million are facing acute food insecurity, when you look at the displacement, internal displacement numbers, the refugee outflows that we have seen into Bangladesh and neighboring countries, it is absolutely clear that this is a matter of international concern and not something that is purely relegated to internal affairs. And I think I need to make that point very clear at the beginning. Look, at the elections, let's disentangle what elections, free and fair elections, mean. In a context where you have autocratic military rule, where you have an ongoing internal armed conflict, where half of the political class is arbitrarily detained, where you still have ongoing violence against civilians and civilian inhabited areas, where you have the military purging nearly all political parties who have opposed their coup, declaring the largest parties illegal, where the voter and party registration processes have lacked any compliance with standards of independence, fairness, representative democracy and legitimacy, where villagers have been warning us that they fear the military will deploy units to force villagers to vote. I mean, frankly, can anyone support such elections? Because that will neither realize the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Myanmar people, nor create the conditions for long-term peace, stability and sustainable development. So I agree entirely with the ASEAN chair that elections will not end the violence or resolve the crisis. The only thing that can lead to that is de-escalation and humanitarian access. Elections are not going to be the solution. I welcome also the focus of many of you on the Rohingya issue. We will have the conference on the 30th of September, the high-level conference. I hope it will galvanize action. I hope there will be a stronger commitment and a roadmap for durable solutions and accountability. I mean, it is, of course, worrying that we have seen the suspension of aid programs for Rohingya in Bangladesh in particular. And I also agree with Malaysia that a comprehensive approach is needed. It's not only, the focus cannot only be on voluntary repatriation, because as we know at the current circumstances that's not possible because the conditions are not there, but we need more legal status, we need more integration of Rohingya, we need resettlement, we need all kinds of other avenues. And in any case, we cannot allow international law to be violated through pushbacks or instances of refoulement. I also want to, and that's the last point out that this is an interesting example of strong collaboration within the human rights ecosystem. So each component of the response to Myanmar plays its part. My office, as you know, based in Bangkok, which continues to monitor and provide credible, verified and authoritative information so that we can report back to you, to the Human Rights Council on the situation and provide the early warnings, the independent international mechanism for Myanmar, with the evidence collection, which is incredibly important, the special rapporteur in his advocacy and reports, and the cases that are currently before the ICC and the ICJ. All of this plays its part, but we need absolutely clear member state action on the many recommendations that all of us have provided, including the Security Council, in order to see a sea change in Myanmar. Again, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Ceci nous amène à la fin de ce dialogue interactif renforcé. Je tiens à remercier tous les intervenants pour leur participation et leur présentation. Nous ferons une courte pause avant d'entamer le dialogue interactif sur le Sri Lanka. Merci.
Is ready.
Excellences, distingués collègues, s'il vous plaît, nous allons entamer le dialogue interactif sur le rapport du Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme sur la situation des droits de l'homme au Sri Lanka, conformément à la résolution 57/1 du Conseil. Je rappelle que la durée des dialogues interactifs est d'1 heure et 30 minutes. Cependant, en fonction du nombre de délégations inscrites pour chaque dialogue interactif, si le temps nous le permet, les vice-présidents et moi-même détermineront si nous pouvons dépasser la durée d'1 heure et demie pour certains dialogues afin de donner la parole à davantage de délégations. J'ai l'honneur d'accueillir M. Volker Turk, haut-commissaire aux droits de l'homme, pour présenter le rapport. Vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Excellencies, Sri Lanka today has an historic opportunity to heal from the cycles of violence and impunity that have dominated for decades. The government has a clear mandate from across the nation for transformative reform, accountability, truth and justice. During my recent visit, the country's leadership pledged a fresh direction on long-standing issues. It is crucial for this approach to be translated into a coherent, time-bound plan for concrete action. The report I'm presenting today sets out key areas for focus, including delivering accountability and justice, fundamental legal and institutional reforms, and eliminating the discrimination and the division that have poisoned politics for generations. Mr. President, Excellencies, first and foremost, my report calls for decisive action by the government on justice and accountability, which are essential to fostering a future of healing, reconciliation and sustainable peace. I welcome the government's pledge to take action on major, long-standing issues, including strengthening the rule of law and ending ethnic discrimination and the politics of division. During my visit, I witnessed the continued suffering of victims of human rights violations and abuses. At a mass gravesite at Chemani, I met a family who were searching for and grieving the loss of a loved one. A woman from a southern province told me that after 30 years, she is still looking for her husband. Independent, transparent and credible investigations are critical to restoring trust. My report notes that conflict-related sexual violence remains deeply stigmatized and many survivors feel completely abandoned. Impunity can be a second form of violence that perpetuates cycles of harm. The demands of victims and survivors must be addressed. Their voices must guide the government's policies on accountability, truth, justice and reparation. This calls for a formal acknowledgement of violations and abuses, including during the civil war. Victims and survivors need the state and its security forces to accept responsibility and recognize the lasting impact of violations and crimes committed by them, alongside those committed by non-state armed groups such as the LTTE. There must be a shared sense of the facts and a shared conviction that justice is being served. I welcome the President's statements in this regard and the increased space for memorialization by victims. Second, there is an urgent need for Sri Lanka to undertake deep constitutional, legal and institutional reforms. This is crucial to ensuring that the tragedies of the past can never be repeated. I welcome the government's initiative to establish an independent public prosecution office with independent investigators. It is important for civil society organizations to be included in this process. My report recommends setting up a dedicated judicial mechanism with an independent special counsel to look into violations of international human rights and humanitarian law over previous decades. I urge immediate and sustained action to address deaths in custody and torture, which remain systemic issues. And I strongly encourage legislative reform in relation to counter-terrorism and civic space. Despite the government's commitment to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act, arbitrary arrests and detentions under the law continue. I urge the government to impose an immediate moratorium on the use of this act. My report also calls for the amendment or repeal of other laws or proposed laws that restrict fundamental rights, civil and political rights. These include the Online Safety Act, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Act, the draft NGO Bill, and the draft Personal Data Protection Act. Despite an increasingly open civic space, my report describes ongoing, persistent patterns of intimidation and harassment by security agencies of human rights defenders, victims groups, and independent journalists. People working on accountability for enforced disappearances and those working on land disputes and environmental issues are particular targets. This underlines the need to change the mindset and practice of security agencies. There is an urgent need for comprehensive security sector reform, including the demilitarization of the North and East, the return of land, and the devolution of power to all levels of governance. Mr. President, third, I welcome the new government's declared commitment to economic and social justice. My report notes that many Sri Lankans are enduring extreme hardship after the worst economic crisis in living memory. Both the poverty rate and food prices have almost doubled in the past 5 years. Malnutrition and childhood stunting have increased by almost a third. Support for the Malayaha Tamil community needs to be a priority. Sri Lanka's debt situation remains concerning. This year's budget allocated almost 60% of revenue to interest payments, which are expected to remain high for the next decade. the imposition of new tariffs by the United States will also have a serious impact on the clothing sector, a cornerstone of Sri Lanka's economy. My report welcomes the government's efforts to strengthen the social safety net and to tackle corruption and economic mismanagement. I hope this wave of change can be the basis for a new social contract and a transition towards a human rights economy in which all financial and budgeting decisions take the protection of human rights into account. I also urge external creditors to provide Sri Lanka with the fiscal space it needs to invest in its people and their economic, social and cultural rights. Mr. President, international engagement through my office, through this Council and the human rights mechanisms can play an important part in the change Sri Lanka so desperately needs. My office stands ready to assist Sri Lanka on this journey. One example of our work, mandated by the Council, is the Sri Lanka Accountability Project, through which we have built a secure repository of over 105,000 items of evidence, a critical resource for legal processes, justice and truth-seeking. I call on all Member States to support this work. I also call on them to cooperate in investigating and prosecuting alleged perpetrators of international crimes committed in Sri Lanka under principles of universal jurisdiction and to explore further sanctions against people credibly accused of gross violations of human rights. I encourage Sri Lanka to seek international assistance with the exhumation of mass graves and other investigations. Together, the international community can support Sri Lankans to escape from the twin threats posed by persistent impunity and deep inequality. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je donne maintenant la parole au distingué représentant du Sri Lanka. Vous disposez de 5 minutes.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, 1 year ago, the people of Sri Lanka voted with one voice to bring about a transformation and usher in a new political culture. Our democratic traditions have been upheld through timely elections held in free, fair and peaceful manner. A number of measures have been introduced to promote the economic and social well-being of the people, to strengthen reconciliation and ensure social justice. Mr. President, the government has provided comments on the High Commissioner's report, and I wish to address some of the matters raised in it. Our anti-corruption drive has been strengthened with new legislation enabling independent investigations and prosecutions leading to landmark convictions. The government is in the process of repealing the PTA and introducing new counter-terrorism legislation. Amendments are being formulated through consultations to the Online Safety Act. The government continues to strengthen the domestic reconciliation mechanisms by guaranteeing their independence and the necessary financial and human resources allocations. Respecting the right for truth and justice, the government has allocated required resources for excavations at the Chemmani grave site, which are being carried out under judicial supervision. Further consultations are underway with a view to establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Cabinet of Ministers approved the proposal to prepare a national policy and action plan on reconciliation and coexistence. The government has issued instructions to law enforcement authorities to guarantee and enabling environment and sufficient space for civil society. People from all parts of the country memorialize their loved ones without any hindrance. In line with the government's vision and commitment for a reconciled Sri Lanka, a Sri Lanka Day is to be celebrated in the first week of December. Views of the general public and the National Human Rights Commission have been called for the establishment of an independent public prosecutor's office. Mr. President, the Attorney General would prefer indictments only if there is a prima facie case against an accused, and as such, the negative portrayal of the AG's office in the report does not stand to reason. The prosecutorial discretion of the Attorney General is not an unfettered power and is subject to the full force of judicial review. The reference to the amended Personal Data Protection Act in the report is erroneous, as the proposed revisions are not related to exemptions as indicated. The government is committed to advancing accountability through credible domestic processes. Recent decisions by the Sri Lankan courts demonstrate the independence of the Sri Lankan judiciary. The government has afforded full independence to the police, and investigations have been resumed into many long-standing cases, including the Easter Sunday attacks and attacks against journalists. A large majority of lands have been released. Adequate compensation is paid to rightful owners where release is not possible. A cabinet-appointed committee is addressing competing claims and land issues faced by people living in areas identified as state reserves and places of archaeological significance. To build confidence among the public, the government is taking several initiatives, including opening of roads, infrastructure, development, livelihood support, and promotion of industries. Legislation is being formulated to increase wages in the plantation sector, while over 5,000 houses are to be handed over shortly. A bill introducing a right-centered approach to persons with disabilities is to be presented to the Parliament soon. Sri Lanka has continued to engage constructively with this Council, OSCHR, as well as with the regular human rights mechanisms. Mr. President, developments within less than a year clearly demonstrate our genuine commitment and determination to protect and promote the rights and well-being of all Sri Lankans through our domestic processes. Therefore, the government is opposed to any external mechanism imposed on us, such as the Sri Lanka Accountability Project, which serves to create divisions and complicate the national reconciliation process underway in Sri Lanka. We are committed to working towards a country that respects and celebrates the diversity of its people in line with our domestic legal framework. The government will continue to work in close cooperation with the international community through capacity building and technical assistance in mutually agreed areas to further strengthen these efforts. We urge this Council to take note of the progress made within a short period. We seek your continued support to provide us the time and space that is required to make use of this historic opportunity to advance the rights and well-being of Sri Lankans through national processes. Thank you.
Merci. J'invite à présent les délégations intéressées à poser des questions au rapporteur spécial et à formuler des commentaires sur les déclarations. Le temps de parole est limité à 1 minute et 30 secondes pour chaque intervention. Il nous reste le temps pour 3 interventions ce matin. Et je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Koweït au nom du GCC.
السيد الرئيس، أخذت دول مجلس التعاون علما بتقرير المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان حول حالة حقوق الإنسان في سريلانكا. السيد الرئيس، تتابع دول مجلس التعاون باهتمام التطورات الأخيرة في سريلانكا، ولا سيما تشكيل الحكومة الجديدة وما أبدته من تعهدات إصلاحية والتزامها بتعزيز الشفافية والحكم الرشيد، كما تثمن الجهود المبذولة في التخفيف من حدة الأزمة الاقتصادية وتعزيز الأمن الغذائي وتوسيع شبكات الحماية الاجتماعية وتقديم الدعم للأسر الفقيرة. كما ترحب دول المجلس بتفاعل الحكومة السريلانكية مع آليات حقوق الإنسان الدولية. وفي هذا السياق تتطلع دول المجلس لاستمرار حكومة سريلانكا في اتخاذ الخطوات اللازمة باتجاه الإصلاحات التشريعية وضمان فعالية الحوار للوصول إلى المصالحة الوطنية التي تهدف إلى تحقيق الاستقرار وضمان اعتماد رؤية مشتركة لتعزيز حقوق الإنسان على أراضيها. ختاما، تشجع دول المجلس على دعم الجهود التي تقوم بها حكومة سريلانكا من خلال التعاون الفني وبناء القدرات والحوار البناء. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Royaume-Uni au nom d'un groupe de pays.
Thank you, Mr. President. This statement is on behalf of the Sri Lanka Core Group comprising Canada, Malawi, Montenegro, North Macedonia and the United Kingdom. We are grateful for Minister Herath's presence here today. High Commissioner, thank you for your report and recent country visit, which underscored both enduring challenges and opportunities for reform. Your office has previously documented gross human rights violations and abuses, including unlawful killings, enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, and arbitrary detentions. As you noted, Sri Lanka has an opportunity to break from its past and heal deep scars that continue to impact victims, survivors, and their families. We welcome the government's decision to abolish the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We urge the government to turn its commitments into meaningful actions on human rights, accountability, reconciliation, good governance, and constitutional reform. Addressing long-standing impunity is essential to build trust among victims and survivors in domestic judicial processes. We fully support independent and effective public prosecutorial body. It is crucial that investigations at mass grave sites are carried out in line with international standards and that journalists, human rights defenders and civil society organisations can operate freely and safely. We remain willing to work constructively with Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Union européenne.
Monsieur le Président, the European Union welcomes the OHCHR's report on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. High Commissioner, as you said after your visit, the country's new government has a historic opportunity to break from the past. We welcome that its leadership pledges a fresh direction, including delivering justice for victims, restoring the rule of law, and eliminating discrimination. It now needs a comprehensive roadmap to translate this commitment into results. The European Union supports this call, reflected in the present report. The European Union recalls the increasing need for transitional justice. We acknowledge the government's efforts, including the initiative to establish an independent public prosecution office. However, we remain concerned over the lack of significant progress on accountability and justice for the victims, especially with respect to the many cases of dead and still missing persons. This situation needs to be addressed urgently and with decisive commitment. Accountability is central to the rule of law and for guarantees of non-repetition. The European Union monitors the human rights situation and remains concerned about the continued use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, while recognizing ongoing steps forward repealing this legislation. We recall the importance of legal and institutional reforms, as well as the need to bring new legislation fully in line with international human rights obligations. The European Union stands ready to support Sri Lanka in implementing transformative reforms and strengthening the protection of human rights, welcoming its continued cooperation with the United Nations human rights system. Thank you.
Merci. La liste des orateurs est maintenant close. Excellences, distingués collègues, ceci nous amène à la fin de cette séance. Nous nous retrouvons cet après-midi à 15 h afin de continuer le dialogue interactif sur la situation des droits de l'homme au Sri Lanka, puis entamer le dialogue interactif renforcé sur la situation des droits de l'homme en Afghanistan, suivi du dialogue interactif avec la Commission d'établissement des faits pour le Soudan. Avant de clore cette séance, j'aimerais vous permettre une petite remarque. Vous avez probablement remarqué qu'on n'est plus dans la salle habituelle du Conseil, qu'on a bougé dans une autre. J'aimerais profiter de remercier sincèrement tous les collègues du secrétariat, de l'Haut-Commissariat de ONU Genève, les techniciens, tout le monde qui a aidé à cette fluide transition d'une salle à l'autre. Ça vous paraît peut-être automatique, je peux vous rassurer, il y avait l'un ou l'autre défi. Pas qu'on s'en est rendu compte ce matin. Alors, merci beaucoup aux collègues pour tout ça. Et avec cela, je déclare close la première séance de la 60e session du Conseil des droits de l'homme. Merci et bon appétit.